Hello, my name is Alessandro Arena de Rosa. I am an independent tabletop game designer, and today I'd like to talk about why I don't super vibe with Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. Before we get started, I'd like to start by saying 5th Edition is not a bad game. It's got a lot of really good design and a lot of really smart people and really creative people behind it. And if you really like this game, that is super valid. I really get why people vibe with this game, and I'm going to go over that at the end of the video along with my personal experience, but I wanted to start by just saying, like, the problems I seem to have with it and just sort of like why I don't reach for it as my go-to RPG of choice. Also, this video presupposes that you already know how 5th edition works. This is not any kind of tutorial, so if you need that, not really the place. Okay, first and foremost, randomness. I always find how systems handle randomness and statistics to be really interesting, and I think that randomness can actually add a lot of really awesome flavor to a lot of RPGs. It's kind of what adds this awesome, unexpected element, especially when you're getting into things like wild magic tables. That is really strong in D&D. Randomness in skill checks, not so much. So in a general skill check, something you're fairly proficient at, but something that you're being challenged in, you're usually looking at, a +4, +5 bonus. That challenging roll that you're doing is somewhere around a 15 or a 16. What this math boils down to is you're looking at something like a 50-50 shot that you either do the thing or you don't. Really good DMs will have really interesting consequences for, failure, and that'll snowball into really good storytelling, so that 50-50 shot isn't terrible. Until we get into combat. And this is where D&D falls flat on its face, in my opinion. So in combat, what this can quickly mean, especially when you're dealing with 3, maybe 4 players, and even more, this gets even worse, you are patiently sitting on your hands, watching your compatriots do cool things to roll a d20 and have a 50-50 shot of doing absolutely nothing. And the DM will look at you and simply say, your sword hits the ground, who's next in initiative? And that is a really bad feel. Powered by the Apocalypse is a really interesting solution to this, where there's sort of like this middle ground where you kind of succeed, but there's a complication. You pick that lock, but all of a sudden the lock is broken and now everyone's going to know that you picked that lock. And I like that because it forces that everyone to be telling a story together and really focuses on an interesting narrative where things are not always going in the player's favor, but everything's progressing, because a lot of the times failure, especially when handled by a novice DM, can just kind of create a standstill. That does not feel good. However, instead, D&D kind of favors doing things as they've always been done, which brings us to this mess. This is what happens when 40 years of differing design philosophies and ideas coalesce in some strange abstract cross between Dark Souls 3 and an Excel sheet. Where to even begin? Why are there 18 skills and yet 6 stats that are based off of them, and yet 5 of those skills are based off of wisdom and none of them are based off of constitution? Why is there so much room to track my maximum and current HP, and yet I only get these tiny little boxes to track my weapons? And this is ignoring how problematic and clunky these are, especially in the context of the modern rules. So this is before we even get into magic, which is this whole another headache of a thing that is why I do not vibe with D&D. We like to pretend like D&D is some lingua franca for tabletop RPGs, but the magic system is so inscrutable and varies so much class to class that you are functionally playing a new game every time that you decide to play as a different magic user class. The way a warlock functions and a wizard functions and a druid functions are so radically different, and it makes sense. A warlock has a patron, and a druid is drawing magic from nature, and a wizard is learning spells. I get the narrative difference between these. There is a better way, I promise you. And video game RPGs were literally based off of D&D for the longest time. This is how you got Dragon Quest and Ultima and all these great classics. And those genres evolved with the time so that things were a little more streamlined, a little more standardized. They learned that you can kind of milk this flavor out without causing confusion. The Dragon Age games are a really good example of that, in my opinion. They have really flavorful abilities, but every class feels on parity, which is another whole thing in D&D where people will tell you that, fighters level up linearly and wizards just sort of branch out into this magic coalescence of I can bend reality. And to Wizards' credit, they tried to solve this in 4th edition. I don't think they did a good job. Most people don't think they did a good job. Like, I like what 4th edition was trying to do, but I think it is a little too clunky for its own good, and that is generally the vibe I get from a lot of D&D. But, like, they tried, so, like, kudos to them. And then everyone yelled at them, and they were like, forget it, we're gonna just go back to everything being confusing. That's what you guys want. And I think that actually is what some of you guys want, so, like, I respect that. But moving on. This, of course, ties into the minimum control, maximum paperwork progression system in the game, which essentially asks you to measure your character's BMI before you can get some vague semblance of guiding them into the path that you want to, and just looking at this weird spreadsheet and saying, okay, what do I get now? And, like, maybe if you own Xanthar's Guide and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, you'll, like, have some, like, interesting choices there, but, like, that's like an extra $30 that you have to pay just for the game to feel varied, which is not good. It's rife for homebrewing, which is, like, again, something that we'll get to and, like, something that I get, but it's just, it doesn't feel like my character is meaningfully growing in any kind of way a lot of the time. And it's not feeling like I have any particularly good options most of the time. It's just, I get stronger and then enemies get stronger. And then it's like, why did I even level up? Why wasn't everything just the same level? And we just kept rolling the same dice. But that is the illusion of progression, which is a whole different video that I might do at some point. All of this combines for a game that is wholly intimidating and, in my opinion, kind of unapproachable. It demands a genuine time commitment from its players, and yet once you kind of understand the breadth of what's there, there is not much depth underneath it. It is an intricate system of bells and whistles to roll a 9, and your DM kind of just gently looks at you and says, yeah, you failed to intimidate the guy, but he's not mad or anything. You just failed. We talk so much about how DMs should be giving players more choice, more agency, how we need to remind ourselves that it is fundamentally their story, and we need to be making sure that we give room for that. We so rarely talk about how the dice and the rules are a huge part of what takes away from that player's story and can often obstruct any kind of interesting narrative that is happening. Which brings me to my final point, which is that I don't actually ever think I see people playing D&D as it is written or as it is intended to be played. I mostly see people doing homebrews. I see people throwing out whole chunks of the mechanics. I see that this game is something that most people can quickly identify as broken and will patch their own fixes to kind of scaffold their own game around it. And that's really cool from a community standpoint, but it shows a real weakness in the game design when that is something that is not optional, but mandatory. I don't personally watch Critical Role, but whenever I hear people talking about it, it doesn't sound like it's good because of the mechanics of D&D and because these actors are following their alignment chart. It sounds like it's good because it's a group of people earnestly telling a story together that is really compelling. In conclusion, D&D has always felt like the plain Lay's chips of RPGs. It's instantly recognizable, readily available, everyone knows what it is, and it's actually really, really good with the right onion dip. And yet, even Utz kind of does a better job, and that's before we even get into stuff like Cheetos, Doritos, and our lovely caramel popcorns. There is so much else out there that is really amazing and awesome to play, and D&D is just kind of at the bottom of the barrel for me. And if you haven't explored those other avenues, I really, really strongly recommend it, because you don't know what mechanics can actually do for the narrative and the play of your game until you start playing a tabletop RPG with really good ones. Okay, now, having all of that said, there is definitely some good stuff, and I want to start with that recognizability. It is a game that is pretty much ubiquitous at this point and is almost universally associated with the tabletop RPG. If you know tabletop RPG players, they are going to know how to play this game. And if you know someone who is looking to get into this, this is the game they will have heard on either in podcasts or on TV. Like, this is the one that people see the most. So it's the one that has the most interest in it and is kind of the easiest to explain to new players, only in the sense that they have a little bit of context for it already. And credit where credit is due. Wizards of the Coast, for all its problems, has written some really amazing settings and has created a really interesting and flavorful mythos that I think a lot of people get really into. I personally bought Rime of the Frostbane when it first came out, and I don't even play D&D. The setting was just that compelling, and I wasn't disappointed flipping through that bestiary and looking at what they had for dungeons. Could it have been a little bit better if the mechanics were better? Sure, probably. But, like, that book was really good, and I get people who, get hooked in on Curse of Strahd or Descent into Avernus, how they see this setting, and it is built for D&D 5e, for better or worse, and that setting is strong and is something that is really fun to run. Which, speaking of expanded books, Xanthar's Guide and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything are both really fantastic supplements. They add a lot of changes to the rules that I think should have been in from the get-go, but they add more flavors to the classes, more things you could do. They don't really scratch my itch, and I was a little disappointed by them because I always thought that they should have a little more character in them, but I understand why they're a little more crunchy and they're a little more slim. That said, I'm the kind of person who kind of went into D&D 5e hearing modularity, like this game that's going to be like really kind of crunchy and you can kind of slot in and slot out whatever you need. And I thought that was really cool. But what it actually was what D&D has always been, which is, yeah, you can kind of just drop mechanics you don't like and we'll write some other stuff, but it's just kind of whatever. And I don't know, that was disappointing for me. But I understand why, people get excited about it, why people get excited for Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. That was a really cool book and another one that I got on release. And, like, again, wasn't super duper my thing, but I appreciated it. There's also a real tangible legacy behind Dungeons & Dragons that is not at all mechanics related. Where I see a kind of aged war game, a lot of people feel a sense of home. They feel that culture of, knowing that setting really well. They feel that culture of collecting the dice and having the dice trays and painting your own models and collecting your own models and knowing all the characters' names and watching your favorite streamers play an adventure that you just played through last week. There's a real sense of community there that I really get why people like. But my history with D&D is not anything like that. I got into it around like 2006, 2007 as a young little 10, 11-year-old who'd saved up just enough money to get the D&D 3rd edition basic box at Barnes & Noble. And I'm not gonna lie, that game, even in its most basic stripped down form, if you don't know what it looks like this. It's got some beautiful models, and this picture captures all of the things of it perfectly. It was still a little too hard to get into. I understood how skill checks worked, so I mostly ran that. And within about a week or two, I was already, using the family computer trying to make my own system called Unbound Heroes, which was kind of my first foray into game design. So thank you, Wizards, for pushing me to do that, I guess, by making a system that I was not able to get as a 12-year-old, so instead decided to write my own. I'll see if I can dig that up sometime. It wasn't even until the last couple of years, around 2019, that I even started playing 5th edition. I was aware that it was around. I'd been reading up on it, and I'd even, read some of the starter PDF stuff, but nothing had ever caught my attention. I'd played Edge of the Empire and Blades in the Dark before I'd even touched 5th edition because nothing about D&D had really pulled me in the same way. And credit where credit is due. 2019 I started playing in a campaign that was really, really fun because the DM was really good at making that system sing because he knew its weaknesses and was able to narrate through them really well. But that's not good. That means the mechanics are failing, in my opinion. And again, kudos to that DM, but even then, I was mostly playing as a super homebrewed character. It wasn't until the start of 2020 where I played as an actual honest-to-goodness character with an actual honest-to-goodness, random world background, random world stats, everything by the books, playing by the books, no homebrew, no nothing. And you know what? It was actually really good because we were playing Curse of Strahd and we almost never encountered any of the mechanics of the game. But yeah, that's why I didn't super vibe with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, or really many of the editions in the past. I'd be interested to talk about 3.5 or 4th at some point, because I have knowledge of those. And I actually really love a lot of the stuff that's based off of, the earlier 1st and 2nd edition. Morkborg is probably one of my favorite systems in recent years, and it is literally D&D, but distilled down to style and substance, and just the crunchiness of the mechanics. It feels really good and really deadly. If you liked this video, feel free to add me on Twitter or add me on LinkedIn, whatever people are doing these days. I will have links. Until then, good luck, have fun. I will see you around.